Hi, everyone. Welcome back to our second installment of our Experience Builder webinar series. If you missed the first installment, feel free to go back and watch it. It does an overview of Experience Builder. But today we're going to be covering the content editing portion of Experience Builder. So we'll go into all of the tips and tricks that we're looking to cover. My name is Allie Naughton, Client Strategy Manager here at listrak, and I'll cover some high-level strategies today about our content editing tools, then pass it to Nick Simon to walk through the tool itself. Today, we'll cover the tools that are available within our content editing function of Experience Builder. And more specifically, we'll cover building forms and fields and some strategies there. Experience Builder makes it super easy to build, manage, test pop-ups without any coding needed. Today, in covering the editor, we'll show you the ease of the drag and drop interface, how you can work, tweak, edit some of our pre-built template libraries for those who want to start from scratch, how to customize things from animation of the pop-up itself or the shape of the pop-up, and then being able to optimize for specific device types like mobile. So a good example is including things like a tap to join button. You'll see that our shared content editor is actually used across our platform, but has specific features that are unique to their content types. So today we'll cover those with Experience Builder. You can see here there are a ton of different options of what you can use within the content editor, things like titling, listing, buttons, tables, dividers, and forms, which we'll talk about on the next slide. Building forms and fields is probably the biggest benefit of building pop-ups within the editor itself. A really easy to use function that allows you to have multiple opt-in points, aka email, SMS, within the same pop-up. You're able to connect those to specific lists or subscription points. You can collect other information too. So a lot of the pop-ups that you'll see in the tool will just show you simple use cases like adding email, adding your SMS. But really, you're able to add anything you want here and map it to that customer profile. So it's really exciting when you think about all the possibilities of what you could add in terms of first-party data that people can give you. Some examples to that would be things like first name, maybe preferences. If you have specific categories or subcategories on your site that you want to ask what they want to hear about, you can ask that all in these experiences. You might have other information like birthday that might prompt other flows that you would like to trigger for that consumer. You can also hide different fields that you would like to map to this consumer. So a good use case might be they have a source of your entry pop-up or your persistent button that you don't need them to fill that in the pop-up itself, but you want to check that field off in the back end. All of those things are possible, and it really sets the stage for personalization way past the experience on site. So you can personalize any of the messages that you send to this consumer, either in email or SMS, and be able to target them specifically. I'll pass it to Nick, and he'll walk through the platform and showing you very specifically the editing function in Experience Builder.
Thanks, Allie. My name is Nick Simon. I'm the Group Product Manager at listrak over our content and GXP product lines. And what I want to do today is do a quick demo and walkthrough of some of the more complex content editing options that are available with inside of the Experience Builder. So I'm going to first start here at the canvas of Experience Builder. It's a little bit of context of content steps. So you can easily drag these steps into the canvas and set up a new step. I'm going to select one that already exists and just talk a little bit about this before we jump into the editor. If you already have a step available, or say you're adding a new one, there are container settings that I do want to highlight. And this is more preferences around kind of the shape, size, and placement of your pop-up. So here you can set some sizing if you want to have more locked-in configurations, or you can leave them to be auto, which basically means sizing to the content you're building, as well as things like the overall background or transparency of the pop-ups. And something really important, people like to control things like the overlay. So when that pop-up shows on site, you're going to have kind of that faded, like blurred background to obscure some of the background to put the focus really on the pop-up. You can change that in here with your transparency settings or even choosing any color, as well as choosing close button functionality. So do you want to have it on the top left or right? Close buttons allow the website visitor to click on the X to hide or close that pop-up for the configured period of time that you have set in your targeting rules. You can also change the close color of that close button. So if you say have a really dark background in your pop-up, you may want to actually change the color to be, say, white so that the contrast is clear. And last but not least is the placement. So if you want to have your pop-up, say, center, placed in the bottom right, bottom left, a lot of people, depending on the strategies, may position them differently. More common ones are center, but there are situations where you maybe want to have a smaller call to action, let's say like a newsletter opt-in to only show in the bottom right, or an informational pop-up about a special sale that's going on with an action to call them to, say, a product deals page to pop up in, say, the bottom left. So there's different ways here to incorporate pop-ups even beyond acquisition. So you can think about that as you're thinking about content editing as a whole. So I'm going to back out of this and I'm going to jump right into the content editor. So you can do that by clicking the edit button on the thumbnail of the canvas or the large edit button in the side panel. So our content editor is designed to try to be as easy and as simple as possible when it comes to creating content. And all the components you see listed in the side panel are all draggable elements that have a unique purpose that can be stacked in any position. So a basic example of that is, say, taking an image item and dragging it to the canvas here. You can see that it's going to place it, and this is kind of a default state. It's like asking for what do you want to do next, right? So in this case, I'm thinking I probably should put some branding on here so you kind of know what this is. So I'm going to go to choose image. This is going to open up our image library. And so any previously uploaded artwork that you've put in here, you can choose, or you can drag directly onto the screen any artwork, say, from your desktop. So I'm going to just grab this kind of style logo, put it on here. Once you've added an image, there's a lot of options you can apply here. So the first one is, say, sizing. I'm going to turn off auto width and I'm going to have a little more control over sizing. So you can go really small to really large. I'm going to try to find something more comfortably in the middle here. And then things like alignment. So if you want to change how it's positioned in the content, if you say you have a more full, like normal square background image, you can do things like rounded corners. You can even control individual corners. So there's a lot of micro functions. So if you see anything that's, say, more options and toggle that on, you'll see options available. Usually this is going to be things like top left or top or bottom, things like padding or margins. So keep that in mind. So I'm kind of happy with that placement or the size of it, but I want to adjust that placement. So I'm going to go and expand this and add some top padding to this so it's not so crammed to the top. But I don't want the pop-up to get too big, so I'm going to go to the text of this first title for Get, and I'm going to adjust the padding a bit down on this one so we kind of compress this creative. Now notice that the author is a little bit too small. So this is a title, kind of a text element here. So this is your main title element. And you have some text styling options. So if you want to do things like underlining, bolding, italics, you can do that on individual words. So if, say, you want to have just bold on the off, you can do that here in text editing. But if you want to apply something to the entire container of the text, for instance, the overall size, you can do that here by either inputting a value or just toggling, you say, plus or minus buttons. So that looks a little bit better. This also has some controls around colors, alignments, line heights, spacing, kind of a lot of common things you'll see across text elements. And that is also applicable to things like our paragraphs and list components. These are just uniquely set up so that things that are really happening more on the back end, like a title versus a paragraph, things like H1 versus P tags, they're more relevant for things in terms of like ADA compliance. So if you want to make sure you're styling and using them more in accordance so that things like screen readers pick up them correctly, you'll want to try to use those more directly. List just gives you a really good way to structure bulleted lists. So you have more control over like the bullets and the stylings and things like that. So I'm going to talk a bit more about forms now. So this is an element that you can drag into the canvas. There's already one here, so I'm just going to click on that. In here, you'll find kind of overall layout controls. So things like the overall width, say the alignment of the fields, font families that are going to be applied to them all, font sizing, and then a section for managing fields, which we'll come back to, and styling options for the label. So if you want to explicitly say, I want the labels to be bold, or I want them on the side or the top, those controls are here. Field options are all stylings applied to the individual field controls. So say if you want the text inside of the fields to be a different color, or say you want to bump up the border of the fields, or even change things like the stylings, you can do that as well. The next section is going to be button options. So this is where you can control the button itself. So that's submit button functionality and all of the styles that apply to it as well. So you can have different colors, alignment options, You can control the sizing as shown, and then even padding. So if you want to add a lot more padding to the button, you do that here, or even spacing. So giving it more padded space between elements. Now, a lot of it, the importance of a form is data capture. So to do that, you want to go into the Edit Forms button at the top. This is going to open up our modal, and this is where you can choose all of your profile fields and some of the configuration. So right now, there's just an email field available, and you'll see that you can define the placeholder text, and because it's the only field and it's a identifiable field, it is locked to being required. So someone can't just submit an empty form field. So I'm going to use an example of, say, adding a birthday. So you can make this required, and this is going to be putting a date picker for that birthday field. Now, another use case we mentioned was, say you want to collect some other data in the form that the user is not necessarily inputting. So you can then also do, say, search for a profile field. So I'm going to find like a source for a pop-up field. And this is basically a checkbox. So I'm going to say that it's checked by default, but I'm also going to make it hidden so that the website visitor itself, when they see this pop-up, they're not going to see this field. They don't need to interact with it at all. But whenever they submit that form with their email address and birthday, it's also going to check that profile field that they came from the pop-up as a source. Now you can use this for a number of things for like promotional purposes, or say they came from an email that was influencer based and you had influencer profile field set up. You could populate that with, say, a known influencer by name. And it allows you to build out more tailored, customized tracking for the profile. And that really feeds downstream into things like Ali was talking about, like more advanced things like journeys, personalized email, and SMS from that. Now, I'll say I'm happy with my email and my birthday field. I'm going to hit next. This last step is really just confirming what happens on the form submission. So by default, we say go to next step, which means as you're building the experience, you have your first step as a pop-up is, say, this form collection, and the next step is your confirmation step. So by default, next step would make sense because on submit, it would just load that next step that's in that experience. Alternatively, sometimes you'll want to, say, send them to an external URL. So you submit the button and it actually launches a new window in the browser and sends them somewhere else. So you may have a pop-up that's completing a brief submission for a sweepstakes and you want to send them to some dedicated landing page. You could do that here. And the last option is close pop-up. So in the event that you just want to fill out a form and close the pop-up and move on, and you don't want to have any extra steps after that, you can leave the close option on. And the last step here for a setting is subscription settings. So if you want to have overriding email unsubscribe, so if someone's previously unsubscribed, but they're now resubscribing on that form, you can turn the setting on so that the email will resub them into the list. So this is just specifically to your email subscription settings. This example, I'll leave it to go to next step since we will want to have a confirmation after this. And you'll see that the form's been updated with your email address and a birthday. And you'll see the managed fields now have all of the options. Now you could do things like move birthday over email and toggle those, but ideally you do want your identifier field first. But you have a little control in terms of layouts here. Now, alternatively, you could change to, say, horizontal, where you put all of the fields beside each other, or maybe going to something like a grid. So if you want to try to compress the space, if you're really limited there and you have a lot of fields, typically we do a lot around vertical stacking, especially if you're only doing like a single field or even only two. So that's kind of the overview for forms. Something else I want to talk about is adding in actions. And part of that I want to do is a representation of, say, adding a button to the canvas here. So it's going to come in with like a very generic default style. I want to update this with the same color as the submit button. I'm also going to, say, change the size of this, make it look more like the submit button. You can control things like button radius. So if you want to make it square versus round, you could even add to, say, the content padding. So again, mimicking more of like the form button. You can change the overall font size. So I'll say we'll bump this up some. And then say we want to switch it to a different font, right? Cabin, we'll make it bold. Clicking into the button, you can actually completely change the text in here as well. And we'll treat this like a tap to join function. So triggering a tap to join message, which means opening up your mobile device into the messaging app and actually sending an SMS opt-in message to really help improve overall SMS acquisition rates. Now, the interesting thing here is that whenever you have this button, you'll see at the top in the settings an add action option. When you click this, it'll open a modal. And here you can choose to, again, use next step, URL, or close that we mentioned before. But there's another option here for tap to join. This is where you can choose your sender code and then the corresponding keyword that you want to have linked to that. So that when the message is sent in through that mobile device, it's actually opting into that designated shortcode. So by doing that, it's going to automatically add those settings in. You'll see those previewed here in the side panel. And now it's ready to work and it would be fully functional. Now, this layout looks a little weird. So one thing you'll notice is that we have a desktop versus mobile preview option here at the top. And so when you toggle between these two, things get a little different looking. But we know that we don't want the tap to join to show on desktop devices. You actually want this to only be on mobile. At inverse, you wouldn't want the form to show on mobile devices. You only want them to be on desktop. So what we can do here is by selecting the form element, in the bottom settings, you'll see a setting that allows you to hide on and choose a device type. So on the form, I want to say hide on mobile. And going to the tap to join button, I want to the equivalent to say hide on desktop. You'll notice that it gets grayed out on this desktop view. There is a third button that appears for visibility on. What this means is that if you click this and the eye is slashed out, it'll hide elements that aren't supposed to be on the device that you're previewing at. So right now, this is what the desktop device would look like versus what the mobile would look like. And so you'll notice that the image that was on the desktop is now gone because it was also selected to be hidden on mobile. So this is a really powerful way to do personalized content by device type. So you don't have to create individual steps for every device type and do really complex splitting and configuration. You can do it within a single step. And so now we have the ability to collect an email address or birthday on desktop in this step, or if this is only seen on mobile, just send them directly into SMS. And so now this is fully configured, but you'll notice that the mobile looks a little weird. Now, one thing you'll notice is in the settings, if say I go to the images, there are places where this little pill shows up that says mobile. Same thing with text. These are mobile specific stylings. So when you're in the mobile preview state, you can choose an element and anywhere where you see that mobile styling, you can adjust it. So to make this really obvious, I'm going to change this to something really small just so you can see that when I toggle back to desktop, it's going to return back to that 60 point size for the font on desktop. But on mobile, it's still that 30. So this is where you can really have a lot more granular control of styling between desktop and mobile. So if I wanted to say collapse some of the padding here so it's not so spaced out on mobile, but on desktop it's not affected, you can do that. So again, there's a lot more control that you can have between a desktop and a mobile device. The last thing I want to touch on here is in the contents, there is a block for HTML. So as much as we want this to be fully drag and drop, we understand that some people want to do really complex stuff with code. So if you do want to have more control of building a custom component in HTML or CSS, there is a full editor that allows you to do that. So you can paste in your code, you can see it preview and render in here in real time. You'll notice in this test snippet, the output should just be I'm a new HTML block, and you'll see that preview in here. If you're wanting to do more complex things, things like JavaScript or something else, you'll want to go into test mode and actually test that on the site, as most of that will not function in the preview state. And before we wrap up here, I just want to talk briefly about one other aspect about the overall editor. So we kind of jumped right in, talked about components and how that was set up, but there is a larger piece of structuring content for rows. And so you'll notice when I have a hover over this entire element, there's a single row at play. And so inside of the row settings, you can do things like background colors, row colors. You can apply a full background image to the row. There's layout options. But the most important thing to know is that you have control over a column structure. So columns total up to 12. So you can have multiple columns. In this case, there was a 2 column, one with all the content on the left and then the image on the right. But if you wanted to add in, say, a third column or a fourth, you could do that. And then by selecting each column, you have individual column settings. You can also delete them out if you don't need them. Inside the column settings, you could say have a unique color. So if you wanted to set a color within that column, you could, or leave it transparent and it would inherit the overall background colors. So there's a lot more options here to play around with rows. So when you think of styling options, sometimes you'll just have a single column for the entire thing and all your content is stacked vertically. Very common ones for pop-ups is to do 2 columns, sometimes even 3, depending on the size of the pop-up. So keep that in mind as you're thinking through how you want to, say, create a completely brand new pop-up. Most of our content templates that we provide have variations in structure and styling, as well as example language and creative to help kind of give you a little bit of idea to start with from a basis of things we've seen tried and true with good performance metrics ourselves. So I hope this was really helpful. This was kind of a more deeper look into some of the functionality. There's a lot more components at play here we didn't go completely into, but definitely get in here, play around with some of these different options. And there's a lot more information available in our Help Center to really outline the different components in here as well. And I'll turn it back to you, Allie.
Thanks, Nick. And thanks everyone for joining today in our second webinar in our Experience Builder series. If you have any questions about activating or enabling Experience Builder in your account, please talk to your account manager and stay tuned for the next webinar in our series of Experience Builder. Thank you.